This is Note Taker 4 on Scientific Method and Experimental Design. Throughout this note taker, we will be reviewing the steps in scientific method, and we'll be taking a closer look at each of these steps, and some examples will follow. The basic steps in the scientific method are as follows. First, you need to state the problem. Another way to say this is to ask a question. Without that, there is no experiment to follow. The second step is to gather information. Third is to use that information to form a hypothesis. Once we have a guess of what is going to happen, we need to, step 4, perform the experiment. During the experiment, we'll do step 5, collect, record, and analyze data. And then finally, for step 6, we need to conclude our experiment, write down our results, and then we need to verify. We'll talk about that on a later slide. As two friends walk along a beach in the winter, they wondered why there were icicles hanging from the eaves of the houses, but what they also noticed was that the small pools of seawater that were in the sand were not frozen. They didn't realize it, but they just stated a problem or asked a question to be solved. They might wonder, why is the seawater not frozen? And why is the icicles from the house, why are they frozen? Before they can know the answer, do an experiment, do any of these other steps, they must gather information about how seawater and freshwater differ. How might you think they differ? If you said that seawater has salt and freshwater does not, you are correct. Now, with this, most of you did not have to go to the library and look this up. Most of you knew this. So gathering information is often as simple as activating those prior knowledge cells that you already have in your brain full of knowledge. You don't always have to run to a library to look it up. After you gather information, you need to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess or prediction about how a problem might be solved. And it needs to be written in a certain format. The first part of the sentence must begin with an if. The second part of the sentence will be the then. For this, it is good to know what we're going to use as variables and what we're going to test, because the if portion should have something about the independent variable in it. The then portion of the sentence should have something about the dependent variable, or what we're going to be measuring. So if we were to think up a hypothesis for this problem, it might look like this. If I add salt to the water, then it will not freeze. We will be talking about this hypothesis a little bit more about whether it's correct or not once we reach the conclusion. Once you have an educated guess or hypothesis based on the information we gathered, now we need to prove it. So we're going to do an experiment. The experiment is a set of steps that you're going to follow, or a procedure that you're going to follow, and it's used to prove a hypothesis. So if we were to look at a procedure for an experiment we might do to test the difference between seawater and freshwater, it may look like this. Step 1, fill 2 identical cups with 50 milliliters of room temperature water. Step 2, add 30 grams of salt to 1 cup. You'll want to stir this up. Step 3, place the cups side by side in the freezer. And step 4, record the temperature of each cup every 10 minutes, and also note how long it takes each cup of water to freeze. I mentioned earlier in the notes that we needed to know what our variables were going to be. In addition to what our variables are, independent, dependent, and constants, we also need to have a group that does not change or is not affected by the independent variable. This group is known as the control group. So on the next slide, we're going to look at what our 3 variables would actually be for this experiment and we'll look at what the control group would be. For our variables, our independent variable would be the salt in the water. We have 1 cup with fresh water, and now we have 1 cup with salt water. So that would be our difference, our independent variable, what I am purposely changing. The dependent variable is what we're going to measure. So I'm going to be measuring how long does it take each cup of water to freeze. And the constants are anything that stay the same. We're going to need to use the same cups, equal amounts of water, the same location in the freezer, and we're going to need to use the same types of thermometers to take our measurements each time. Our control group, the group that is not affected by the independent variable, would be the cup of water without the salt. The control group is always going to be the group that is the normal condition. While we're doing the experiment, we are going to collect data. Data is anything that we have observed and measured, and we're going to write it down. But we don't just want to scribble and scratch on a piece of loose leaf paper. We want to record our data in a nice, neat chart called a data table. Once we have completed our data table, then we can create a graph. A graph, the definition is a visual representation of the data. That's a fancy way of saying it's a picture of our data. The following slides are going to look at some examples of data tables and some graphs. None of these that we're going to look at apply to the experiment we've been talking about. Here's an example of a data table. With it, you'll notice that we have the independent variable, the dependent variable, and all of our measurements. The left column, the far left of the data table, you will see the words in the sun and in the dark. These are the locations for the plant. Since they are different, what you're doing different, that is the independent variable. If you look across the top of the data table, you will see height of plant in centimeters. That is our dependent variable. That is what we're measuring. And then you will notice in the other boxes, you will notice how we tracked the growth of the plants, both in the sun and in the dark, through a 4-week period. When we're graphing, we have 2 types of graphs that we can choose from for this class. We are either going to have a bar graph or a line graph. This slide here shows our bar graph. Bar graphs are used to show categories of data. So if you look along the bottom of the graph, you will see paper towel brand. Since we have different brands of paper towels, which is, since we use the word different, that's our independent variable, they're going to be on a bar graph. The left side of the graph, you will notice, has the amount of water absorbed. That would be our dependent variable. It's what we're measuring. If I were to sit out by the stoplight and measure, or count, I should say, not really measure, but count how many cars of each type, whether it's a Nissan or a Ford or a Chevy, stops there at each stoplight, I would actually use a bar graph to graph that data because each type of car is a different category. The line graph, on the other hand, is used to show continuous data. My best advice to you is, anytime we are taking measurements over time, whether it's seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, centuries, anytime you are recording data over time, it's going to go on a line graph. So if we look at this line graph, you see that the bottom of the graph is the year. That is our independent variable. As the years were different, we were measuring on the left side of the graph human population. That is our dependent variable. Just like our bar graph, our independent and dependent variables are always set up in the same way. A good way to remember these when you're making a graph is the phrase dry mix. The word dry, which has the D and the Y, means that the dependent variable goes on the y-axis. The word mix has the I and the X. The independent variable always goes on the x-axis. So if we look back or think back to the experiment we're talking about in these notes with the icicles, which is fresh water, and the unfrozen seawater on the ground, since we are measuring temperature over time, we would use a line graph to show our results. Once you finish the experiment and you have all your information and you've put it in a data table, you have a graph, you've already analyzed everything, now we can reach our conclusion. The conclusion is going to be our solution or final say in our experiment. With the conclusion, you do want to refer back to your hypothesis and state whether or not you did prove that you were correct, or did you disprove your hypothesis, which meant that your original guess was wrong. I will tell you right now, in your conclusion, if you proved your hypothesis wrong, that does not mean you get a 0 on your activity, as long as the rest of the experiment is done correctly, because a hypothesis is just an educated guess at the beginning. Your experiment, I said earlier, was to prove, but we can also use it to disprove an experiment. If you think back through history with all our famous people, let's go back to Thomas Edison and the light bulb. He did not get the right combination the first time. Actually, it probably took him thousands of times to finally get that light bulb correct. So it's okay to be wrong in your hypothesis as long as you've done the rest of the experiment correctly and you've presented your material correctly. Now, the last thing on this slide talks about repeated trials. We need to verify that our results from our experiment are correct. And we do this by repeating our experiment over and over and hoping that we get the same results. This repetition in the experiment is known as repeated trials. When we do experiments here in class, you will need to have at least 3 repeated trials to be accepted. Finally, after the experiment is all said and done, we've got everything completed, now we have to write the lab report to turn in to Miss Ennis for a grade. Our lab reports are going to be a certain format. Your write-up must include a title, and we'll talk about the correct title in just a second. It needs to state your original hypothesis. It does not matter if it was right or wrong. I want to know what your original guess was. You need to list all the materials used in your experiment. You need to list in detail the procedure. You need to include the data table and the graph that you created based on your data. And you need to put in there, about a paragraph long, a conclusion stating what the solution that you came up with in your experiment was. Do not worry if you can't remember all of these parts. In the classroom, hanging on the wall, it's a bright yellow color, I have the template for proper lab reports. You will be able to use this to write your lab reports in the next few classes as we complete some experiments. Now, I said I would get back to the title. We can't just make up a title all willy-nilly. We actually have a format in our science field that creates what we call a proper scientific title. And the format is as follows. The effect of blank, and that blank will be filled in with your independent variable, on blank. The second blank will be what your dependent variable is. So an example from the experiment we've been talking about, it might be the effect of different amounts of salt, that's your independent variable, on the freezing point of water, because we were testing to see how long it took to freeze. If you follow this format and you turn in your proper lab reports, you should be getting an A every time.